Hello everybody and welcome to another guide for Divide et Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be looking at Carthage, which has a rather complex and challenging start position. This is because your empire, while vast and wealthy, is considerably overstretched, and you're forced to make challenging decisions between either expanding in Hispania, consolidating your African possessions, or readying for your war against Rome by taking Syracuse. Otherwise, you don't have more money to play with at the beginning of the campaign than any other factions. Factions with a considerably more simplified position, only owning one settlement or so. This forces you to neglect certain things while focusing on others, and the decisions that you make will make a considerable impact in the way your campaign plays out, either more offensively or defensively compared to the Romans. You also will inevitably be at war with the Romans, so you have a very, very difficult early game opponent. And to be completely frank, the army of Carthage isn't nearly as good as the Roman army, composing of a myriad of nationalities that might have difficulties complementing each other's unique fighting styles. Therefore, in order to be an apt commander on the battlefield, you will have to be quite unique in the way that you use your army. There's no other faction that has the same feel of Carthage, and while it is a very difficult campaign, it's an extremely rewarding and unique one. So let's check out the Carthaginian start position and figure out how best to use this faction. Alright everybody, so this is the Carthaginian start position, and it is rather vast and stretches across the Mediterranean, encompassing so many provinces. In fact, Carthage has by far the most possessions across multiple provinces of any faction start position in Divide et Impera. That doesn't mean that they have the largest number of settlements, although actually, I think that they do. I think they have more than the Seleucids. But what's definitely true, what I can say unequivocally, is that they have possessions in more provinces than any other faction at the start of their campaign. And what that really means is that the Carthaginians are just overstretched. Like, their armies are so far apart that there's no way that they can coordinate cohesively with each other, and you're essentially just operating across different theaters, kind of like the Americans in World War II. It's not like troops dedicated to Japan would be getting over to Germany anytime soon, you know? You're basically fighting in different worlds, whether you're in Hispania or you're more in the eastern Mediterranean, fighting against the Romans in Sicily. So essentially, because of how stretched out the Carthaginians are, you really need to figure out what your game plan is from the very beginning, because you have so many things to invest in, whether it is improving public order in Africa, which you should do. You should be building some temples, you should be building, like, you know, an Odeon here, maybe a temple here. You should be investing in building up these ports, but literally just developing Africa to the extent that you would like would basically waste all of your income that you have saved up. Your entire treasury would just flow sheerly on Africa, and that's neglecting every single other province, whether it is Corsica and Sardinia that you have an entire province of. Of course, you'd like to make this economically useful. Whether it is over here in Mauritania, you have 2 out of 3 settlements, meaning that it might be worthwhile to invest here, especially because, you know, this isn't really a Punic area. You don't have your culture massively represented here, so you might want to build a temple to start stabilizing public order as quickly as you can and make this province somewhat economically viable. You might want to invest in Hispania and campaign here. I mean, Hispania has so many resources, and it's a rather fractured area with just a lot of factions of only one settlement. So you definitely could benefit from just making an army here, you know, building up Hispania as a province, you know, improving your town hall building here and just making it more solid so you can expand across here. So there's just so many things that you want to invest in. So with that in mind, you kind of have to have an intention of what type of Carthaginian campaign you want to play, what type of strategy do you want to adopt. And broadly, I've considered 2 major strategies that make sense, to me at least. 2 things that at the very least I can like understand the utility of doing so. And one is a more defensive Carthaginian approach, and the other one is a more offensive approach. You see, with the Carthaginian campaign in Rome 2, Divide et Impera, you will inevitably find yourself at war with the Romans. There's basically this event that happens every campaign where the Romans, once they've consolidated Italy, you know, wiped out Epirus, wiped out the Etruscans over here, they eventually decide to focus on you, and a war will break out over Sicily. Even if you don't have Sicily, the war will still break out. Like, even if you've basically given everything to the Syracusans, so just let them take it, not even really offered resistance, the Romans will still come after you. So regardless of how it is, an all-out war, a war pretty much to the death with the Romans, is inevitable. And there's really two ways that you can handle this, because Roman early game is incredibly powerful, and they will focus on you if you're Carthage. Like, they're just hell-bent on your destruction. So essentially, what you can do is one of two things to combat the Romans. Either one, you take on the Syracusans rather quickly, because you really do want to take Syracuse if you want to hold on to Sicily with any real chance. Like, Syracuse does actually have a very good early game army. It is a challenge to beat them, plus of course the defensive advantage they have with the city. But you do have so many more resources after Carthaginians and access to war elephants already here in this army. They're not the best war elephants, but any war elephant can be a decisive tool at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, you could make an army here capable of beating Syracuse back and taking their city. But in any case, what I'm trying to get at here is that if you take Syracuse, then you can kind of defend Syracuse, break a couple of Roman armies here, and then invade Italy itself. You can also raise an army over here in Corsica and Sardinia, and then use your navy to bring it over to northern Italy. This type of crunch between the south and the north could probably end the Romans, but it is a risk because the Romans are ultimately a very powerful faction. That's undeniable. They do have better infantry and, in general, in my opinion, a better roster than Carthage going into the early game. So at the end of the day, you will struggle against the Romans, undoubtedly. However, if you are a better commander, if you are just a better player, you could probably beat the Romans in some head-on confrontations and quickly absorb Italy. With the wealth of Italy under your banners, you should be able to quickly recover from, not having neglected your economy early game here and not worried about Africa, and, quickly recover in Africa with all the additional money Italy will get you. Now, the second strategy, and the one that I personally favor more, is a more defensive Carthage, where you more or less give up Sicily, like you just get rid of his army in order to improve your income, and it'll improve it a lot. And, you don't really care about Corsica and Sardinia either. Like, these four settlements are more or less unimportant to you. And you just invest a ton of money into Africa to solidify your early game economy. Like, really go at it. Build up armies over here, and then just work on making your home front far stronger. You can quite easily defend the African coast with navies as well as a full stack army in Carthage. Just hold it here, ready to deploy against the Romans anywhere that they may land. And then just beat the Romans at their own game. They'll be sending troops across Sicily to try to besiege Carthage. You can quickly wipe out those armies with your navy, just with ease. Just sink them one by one. With troop transports, they won't stand a chance against a professional Carthaginian navy. Meanwhile, if you even do land somewhere, you'll have a full stack army to recover. The rest of your army should just be basically invading Hispania, invading Africa, and just making you money. For example, a very common sense strategy, in my opinion, is make an army here. This is kind of the most, in my opinion, easy province to just solidify first. Build up some buildings here that are just going to help you with this province's supplies as well as public order. Make an army here, and then take Retubis, or Retubis, yeah, take this. This faction's pretty bad. Like, early game, like, this is a Libyan faction, and early game Libyan troops are incredibly low armor. We're talking about like 1 armor spearmen. As long as you make a competent army, you can win a pitched battle against these guys, and once you take the settlement, this province with the correct buildings will prove an incredible source of income for you. Afterwards, send this army across the Straits of Gibraltar to Hispania. You own 1 building here in Baetica and 2 here in Hispania. Make another army in Hispania to accompany them, and then just start taking these provinces en masse. It's not particularly hard, and because you would have spent a couple of turns dealing with the guys at Retubis, you will probably encounter some pretty sparsely guarded settlements here in Hispania. If you just play the factions off against each other, make sure to invade provinces that were recently invaded by someone else, so they're not very well defended. With a strategy like that, you should be highly successful and just get many 3 settlements. With 2 or 3 armies operationally, you should be able to outnumber virtually any Hispanian faction, because Hispanian factions, one, they form horrible alliances, like really weak alliances. So in general, you shouldn't have to really face any strong alliances that are working together. And 2, Hispanian factions are rather small in size. They're usually 1 to 2 settlements each. So because of that, you should be able to outnumber them easily, divide and conquer, take these provinces, and use that money to eventually come after the Romans with a vengeance, because you should be able to easily sink so many of our armies across here that they'll just be throwing away their resources as you're becoming far wealthier from the conquest of Hispania. And once you built up that massive amount of income, you could just invade the Roman Empire with like 4 or 5 armies. Just wipe them off the face of the earth with pure aggression from your part. Now, the Carthaginian recruitment system for their armies is unlike any other in the game. So I'm going to show you here, they have 2 different building chains. One is a mercenary barrack, and the other one is the regular, kind of like Libyan Carthaginian barrack. Now, when it comes to these mercenaries, these guys all recruit from your 3rd population class, your subjects class, they're called. And that makes people, or rather troops from the mercenary pool, much easier to recruit. I mean, some of these are like elite troops, although many of them aren't. And to be able to recruit such high caliber troops from your 3rd population class gives you access, unlike any other faction in the game, to relatively competent troops. The only problem is that mercenaries do tend to be a little bit more expensive than regular troops. I would say that you're kind of overpaying maybe like 10 to 20% depending on the troop, but it's still absolutely worth it just because of how accessible these troops are. And besides, you will see when I go over the entire roster of the Carthaginians, but many of your best units do come from your 1st population class, whether it is your cavalry or your elite hoplites, which are very important to your roster. So because of that, you should absolutely use your mercenaries and conserve your 1st class to get some of the better units in your 1st population, which we'll display later. Another unique part of the Carthaginian roster, though, is that many of your units actually come from your settlement buildings. I mean, you can see from your 2nd building here, but you get Carthaginian citizen cavalry as well as your sacred band and archers, all from your 2nd level Carthage building. Once you get to your 3rd, you get a couple more. Well, anyway, you guys kind of get the point. You get sacred band from your 2nd level building, allowing you to recruit sacred band kind of across your empire rather easily, which is a pretty significant perk to playing as the Carthaginians. The sacred band's quite good, and this Carthaginian archer is also an elite skirmisher. So that's kind of one thing. There's a lot of factions where you don't really have that many troops tied to buildings, so it is kind of unique that you have this ability as the Carthaginians to recruit elite troops all across the empire. Simultaneously, though, when it comes to your 1st turn recruitment, you do have some good options, although in some ways you're a little bit deficient, in my opinion. For one, when it comes to for a settlement, I'll show you right here in Carthage. This is where you're going to have the best recruitment. You're going to start out here with your Carthaginian hoplites, and these guys are, by definition, generic hoplites. Like, they have the exact same stats as any Greek hoplite in the game, whether it's Colchus's, Bactrias, the Fenians. Well, the Fenians are a tiny bit different, actually. But, they are like your generic hoplite, which tends to come from your 2nd population class. In Carthage's case, it comes from your 1st population class, making these guys quite difficult to justify recruiting. Simultaneously, you have a buffed up militia hoplite in these Libyan hoplites. They're far better than your typical Greek militia, but they're also not as good as your generic Greek hoplite. But these guys come from your 3rd population class. So it's like, do you want to use an underpowered hoplite, or do you want to use a hoplite which just expends your 1st population basically unjustifiably? Simultaneously, you have some really cost-effective cavalry in these Libyan cavalry. Recruit many of them. They're not like overpowered by any means, but they're just so good for the price. They They do have somewhat low armor, but they also come in a 90-man unit, so that's kind of where they're going to suffer for those additional men, but this is a totally justifiable unit, extremely good for the price. They also come from your third population class, meaning that you're not going to actually have to use up good population, so that's really good. When it comes to your skirmishers, I wouldn't really get the Libyan slingers because they don't use shields, which is a pretty significant weakness for a slinger. Like, they are a little bit cheaper than other slingers that offer 190 range and 11 missile damage, but they also shoot rather slowly. And because of the no shield combined with 1 armor, they'll pretty much get killed by archers, javelins, they'll get quite easily killed by enemy skirmishers. So because of that, I don't really favor them. I much prefer the higher damage archers, which are also quite a bit cheaper. So I totally go for these Libyan archers or javelin men. The javelin men are pretty cost effective. It's just, short range. You really have to just want to cheap out. 74 to maintain these Libyan archers really isn't much. So in my favorite early game skirmisher are the Libyan archers for sure. I get this cavalry, I get this Libyan hoplites, and just make an overall cost-effective army. You also should be researching logistics first, so you can get your mercenary barrack level 1. It just takes 3 turns, so you'll have mercenaries soon enough. And your first mercenary barracks, or it's this one, comes with a lot of really good options, like Greek hoplites. This is just a generic Greek hoplite, but actually, you know what? It has 35 armor, which is actually more. So it has 5 more armor than your typical Greek hoplite. The same combat stats. It's a little bit more expensive. 250 upkeep's definitely more than your typical, generic Greek hoplite will cost, but it comes from your third population class. So you don't really have to worry about population when you're using this beautiful Greek hoplite unit, which just looks really cool in battle. You're going to get some pretty solid Celtic spearmen. These guys, like, they have elite combat stats, just somewhat low armor, but overall a great unit for combat. Or a weaker but very Threo spear like Celtic unit, just really cost effective. Like, within 7 turns you're gonna have a lot of really good mercenaries at your disposal, so don't worry about your limitations in early game for your first couple of turns. Just make like 1 army, one capable of beating this rather weak Libyan faction, and afterwards you're gonna get higher quality units on the table. If you look at your generic mercenary pool, you also have a lot more units here too. You have these Libyan Phoenician mercenary hoplites, which are akin to like later game Carthaginian hoplites. Totally a useful unit, absolutely worth bringing. Really good hoplite. They come from your second population class too, and they're way better than your Carthaginian hoplite. So get these guys in abundance in early game. Simultaneously, you also have these Gallic mercenary warband, which are a axe unit. You can see 26 charge bonus makes these guys a rather adept shock unit. And you're not going to get a lot of shock infantry options as the Carthaginians, so really useful. Also, look at that price, 133 a turn to maintain, incredibly cheap, 225 men, extremely worthwhile mercenary, very cost effective, very good, will obliterate African infantry and be useful against the Romans in a rear charge, so totally useful. These Iberian swordsmen, definitely worth it once you get them. You see, you're not going to have any supply now, but with Carthage, your mercenary pool replenishes rather quickly, so get these guys too. Totally recommend. The other mercenaries you see here are somewhat negligible in quality, but still can be useful in a jiffy. And that's really it when it comes to the Carthaginian start position. I think I've gone over the 2 strategies, the unit roster. The other thing, though, is that the Carthaginians have a lot of options when it comes to people to trade with. Like, you can see that so many factions want a trade agreement because you're just such a powerful faction. Like, you can see over here, like, I can demand 150. I get it. These guys, hi. Let's demand some money. Demand 3,000. Low, apparently. Let's demand less. Moderate. They'll give me 1,500. But you can make so much money just getting trade agreements. Well, I wouldn't get one against these guys because I advise that you attack them. But maybe these guys might be worth it. And they'll give you like 1,500 as well. The only thing I would caution against doing is don't get a trade agreement with Cyrene here, because if you get one of Cyrene, then the Ptolemies will hate you, and you can get a turn 1 trade agreement with the Ptolemies, allowing you to start building amiable relations and, not being hated by the Ptolemies. So I would honestly befriend the Ptolemies, because when you're fighting Rome, you hardly want a potential adversary from the descendants of Alexander themselves. So yeah, I would definitely choose the Ptolemies over Cyrene. Cyrene is just such a non-factor. These guys will never be a bother to you. So Yeah, that's kind of all that I can caution against when it comes to trade agreements. But otherwise, just get agreements with everybody who you don't want to attack. And that way, even though you are in an overstretched position, you can reliably say that you aren't going to be at war with some of these Iberian factions, allowing you to maybe focus more in Africa and also not have to consider war against some of these other factions while you take on their Iberian brethren and rivals. So that way you can kind of enhance that whole divide and conquer strategy that I advise that you use. But anyway, I've rambled on for a lot. I've gone into a lot of depth. This is a very complex start position, as I hope that you've realized so far. But yeah, let's go look at the buffs and debuffs that Carthage has and figure out which Carthaginian family to use, because just like the Romans, you get 3 different options that offer very different buffs and debuffs for Carthage. Alright, so when it comes to the buffs and debuffs that Carthage has, all of the families will come with the same standard Phoenician buffs at the top, and they are quite powerful ones. Both of these, I believe, will have a significant impact in making Carthage a stronger faction for you. Now the first one is plus 10% wealth from all commerce buildings, and this is just good. Commerce encompasses a wide range of buildings, essentially all of the economic buildings that you can build, whether it is the trade-focused yellow building, like things like quarries, things like resource buildings. Those are all commerce. So ultimately, because of that, this plus 10% wealth will make those buildings far more effective, and with any campaign you will be building them. So just in the case of Carthage, all of those buildings will be more powerful, so that's a buff. Then the minus 15% mercenary and elephant upkeep costs are obviously really good, because you will use quite a few mercenaries as Carthage. Now I believe that that is going to apply entirely to like the troops that you recruit in the mercenary pool, like when you just recruit your typical mercenaries, like through the same menu that every faction has. I don't think that impacts units that come from your mercenary barracks. Those are just like standard units, because like ultimately those units are pretty expensive. Like I have found them pretty expensive, so I don't think that this minus 15% actually applies to them. But otherwise, it will impact your regular mercenaries, which are pretty good. Like I mentioned, those Iberian swords are pretty good. You have some decent cavalry options there. And the minus 15% to elephant upkeep costs is particularly important, because elephants are extremely expensive. And Carthage does have the cheapest elephants in general. Like you guys saw on the regular campaign map, but those early game elephants that I had in Sicily were only costing like 300 per turn. And while I don't rate African elephants completely, like particularly well, they are weaker than Indian elephants by far. They are by far the cheapest elephants. So if you don't want to invest too many resources in what is a pretty risky tool, this minus 15% totally incentivizes you to get them. Now when it comes to your faction specific buffs and debuffs, it all comes from which family you choose from. And I think that all of them are valid enough to choose. It really just depends on which things you value and how you tend to play your campaigns. Now the first option is the Hanoid dynasty, or Hananid dynasty. Yeah, Hananid dynasty. These guys come with a diplomatic bonus of all factions, which is obviously quite useful, particularly because you are so overstretched. You really don't want factions having a high chance of just attacking you randomly. So this will just kind of allow you to execute those divide and conquer strategies a lot better. It also will allow you to secure trade agreements with pretty much everybody and make them pay you for it in a rather Trumpian and in at least the way it sounds. So ultimately, this is quite good. This is quite useful. There's just so many ways to use this as Carthage. Totally a worthwhile buff to have. Increased movement for all forces is just generally good too, especially because you have such a large empire that sometimes you will have to make a trek across vast swaths of territory in order to attack the opponent that you want. Or if you want to move one army from one theater of war to the other. All forces also includes navies, so if you're patrolling the Mediterranean, this will allow your navies to have even a greater range than they already have. Ultimately, totally a useful buff. I don't think that it makes your armies just crazy mobile. It's not going to like turn them into the Mongol hordes of a 13th century or anything, but it's still very useful. The problem, of course, is your debuff is crazy. Increased non-mercenary recruitment cost is so expensive, and there are a lot of, like, Carthaginian troops that are definitely part of, like, the staple roster that Carthage uses. So this is a pretty hard thing to stomach. The next option is the Magonid dynasty, because it have lower upkeep for non-mercenaries, so kind of the opposite of the other one, and increased foreign occupation resistance. This basically just means, like, it kind of is a little bit weird sounding here, like increased foreign occupation resistance sounds like a negative thing, but what it basically means is that cultural differences will have a lesser impact on your public order. And you do have cultural differences in every province. Like, even Africa itself is only like 60% Punic. Mauritania is like 20% Punic. I think Hispania is like 40% Punic. Punic being the Phoenician culture that Carthage has. So ultimately, this is a pretty useful thing to have. It will make your early game somewhat easier and make it a little bit less... we could say it's going to be a little bit less necessary for you to invest in public order buildings across your provinces. You can stave off rebellions for a bit longer, and that'll allow you to have a more militaristic start if you wish to do that. So that's kind of significant, but decreased tax rate is just a horrible debuff to have. Like, I feel like this is the weakest family, in my opinion, just because, like, decreased tax rate is so bad. Like, tax revenues are just such an essential part of every single economy that you have in Rome 2, but this is just going to make you poorer. And subsequently, I don't feel like these buffs are really all that good. I mean, yeah, decreased upkeep for non-mercenaries is good, but you can still use mercenaries. You can still just use mercenaries instead. And, you know, non-mercenaries aren't going to be insanely expensive as Carthage. Carthage has a lot of very cost-effective non-mercenary units, so I don't feel like upkeep is really that big of an issue for your units to begin with. Increased foreign resistance is good, but you still want to, you know, invest in, like, public order buildings. So you could totally have good public order without this buff, to be honest with you. Like, you could totally have good public order. So that's not really a problem. Now, the Barkid dynasty is also pretty good in my opinion, and I feel like it has the weakest debuff. I feel like this one is kind of like they're the family that's going to have the least impact on how your campaign is going to go. Because both of these, the Hammonid dynasty and the Magonid dynasty, had really bad debuffs. Like, 2 debuffs that's going to impact your campaign profoundly. These buffs and debuffs just don't really matter. Like, increased agricultural income, good stuff. You're going to have agricultural buildings, so why not have income come from them? The problem, of course, is that because you're going to be more commercially focused because of his plus 10% wealth, plus, of course, the ease of getting so many diplomatic treaties with factions, like so many trade agreements, I just don't feel like agricultural income is ever going to be a huge thing for you. Next, public order bonus for Punic culture. Well, as we mentioned, Punic culture is not especially prevalent in all of your settlements. Like, this is just a nice little bonus to have. Like, once you make your temples that increase your public order, this will be like an extra bonus, incentivizing you to make temples. Nice, but not crazy. Moderate diplomatic penalty with Latin, Iberian, and Greek cultures. Doesn't really matter. Greek cultures you don't deal with a lot. There's only one Latin faction in the game, and that's Rome, and you're going to be at war with them inevitably. The only thing that matters there is the Iberian component. This may drag you into some wars in Iberia, but you will ultimately be at war in Iberia no matter what. Like, that's the main feeder for expansion when it comes to Carthage. Like, right after you're done with Africa, you go to Iberia. So the only thing that makes sense is Carthage. So at the end of the day, this really doesn't have a huge impact on your campaign. So I would either choose Hammonid dynasty if you're kind of feeling more spicy and you can deal with the non-mercenary recruitment cost debuff, or I would just go with the Barkid dynasty if you kind of just don't want to deal with a lot and just play this campaign out somewhat in a somewhat vanilla style. And you just have to choose between these 2 trade-offs. And yeah, that's when it comes to buffs and debuffs. It's somewhat complex, but it's really a trade-off between these 2, or if you wanted troll, I guess you could pick these guys. But anyway, let's go look at the roster now. It's a rather large roster, so there's going to be a lot of analysis to be had. Now, the roster of the Carthaginians is rather massive, as it encompasses a lot of mercenaries, as well as your actual Carthaginian, kind of Phoenician, Libyan style units. And the Carthaginian roster is quite powerful. Right from the onset, I'll say that they are representative of what is an incredibly powerful empire in early game, one that stretched across like half of the Mediterranean world, one that was vast and wealthy and competent. However, it's not the most powerful rosters in the game, and one of those reasons is that they're highly dependent upon phalanxes to make up their main line, that and more looser fighting spearmen. And the phalanxes that they have are exclusively hoplites. They don't have a single pike unit. So their main line is always going to be a somewhat valuable thing, either because they're just gonna lose to pikes or just be a little bit kind of bulky, inflexible, because that's what hoplites are. They're a powerful, line that just pushes forward with unbelievable pressure and aggression, but they are simultaneously rather inflexible, slow to move, that type of thing. And because of that, you'd struggle against the more barbarous and Roman-style factions, which are going to be fighting quite a bit, as well as the successor states, because if you load up on hoplites and they load up on pikes, you're just going to lose. You can't beat pikes with hoplites unless you just vastly outmaneuver your opponent. Of course, hoplites aren't the most maneuverable units, so good luck with that. Your melee infantry is good for what is essentially a Hellenic style faction. Like, the Carthaginian roster feels to me most like a vast improvement on an Athenian roster, a Spartan roster, a Rhodian roster, a Massilian roster. Like, this feels to me like a more classical Greek faction, just with Phoenician and Libyan elements. But it feels like the Phoenician component of the roster more or less fights like a knockoff version of the Greeks, and that's who they were ultimately inspired by. That's where their militaristic culture was copied from. Simultaneously, of course, you do have barbarian mercenaries who do make up a lot of your spears and swords, but you don't have the best versions of those types of units. Like, I would favor the melee and spear line of so many Gallic and Iberian factions over that of the Carthaginians. You don't get their best units. You get some very competent units, but you don't get the best, and that's 100% for sure, and I'll go over why. The cavalry of Carthage is cost-effective, but not elite. The Macedonian-style factions, with the exception of the Egyptians, who have particularly poor cavalry, will in general beat you qualitatively, but in terms of cost efficiency, the Carthaginian cavalry is virtually unmatched. They have such cost-effective cavalry. It's crazy. They have so many good units for the price. So you can bring a lot of Carthaginian cavalry for a very reasonable price, and because of that, your cavalry is just in general a lot more accessible. They're not the most powerful, but in large numbers, they can definitely win fights against good factions. Your missile infantry is amongst the best in the game. This is definitely where Carthage most excels. And amongst hoplites, they have the best hoplites. And even though I consider hoplites a flawed tool, I actually rate the Carthaginian hoplites above that of the Spartans, which is saying something. I really do believe that the Carthaginians have the best hoplites across the board, whether it's by recruitability, whether it is by cost efficiency, whether it is by quality. I believe that the Carthaginians have the best unit in every single category with the exception of a general hoplite. The Macedonians and Spartans, they do have a better 225-man hoplite that's a general, but those units you can only get one per army. So when it comes to a hoplite you can actually spam and make a mainline, this Carthaginian late sacred band is the best unit in the game. So if you can find a tactically effective place to use hoplites, say it's against the Romans, or say it's against another hoplite bearing faction, or against a barbarian faction, these guys will serve you proud. But starting where I usually do, from the generals, you have a couple of general options. You actually have quite a few, 6, but some of them are late game options. So, you don't really have 6, it's more like you have 3, but early game and late game options to choose between them. Your hoplite option starts out with a Sacred Band hoplite. And honestly, the early game Sacred Band isn't particularly good. It's actually a very lackluster elite hoplite. It's one of the weakest elite hoplites in the game. There's very few elite hoplites that are as bad as this one. And I'm just saying that as it is. Across the board, elite hoplites tend to have 9 melee attack. Whoops. Why are we at equipment? Yeah, there we go. There we go. Sorry about that. But yeah, across the board, elite hoplites tend to have 9 melee attack and 19 melee defense, right? These encompass the actual combat ability, but these guys only have 8, 17, also 19 charge, 24 weapon damage. Now, already a poor example because these guys actually have very weak hoplites in early game, akin to the Carthaginian ones. But if you look at actually just a normal, you know, elite hoplite faction, like the most average one, say that of Rhodes, the Rhodian picked hoplite. Yeah, these guys, they have 9 melee attack, 19 melee defense, 2 more charge at 21, 2 more weapon damage at 26, 1 more melee attack, 2 more melee defense, and as well as a standard 38 armor. These guys only have 35 armor. Now, these Carthaginian Sacred Band, you do get access to them quite quickly because they come from your level 2 Carthage Town Hall building. Meaning that you can get these guys like 5 or 6 turns in, which is far sooner than the Rhodians would get theirs, or really most factions would get theirs. So that's really the virtue of these guys, accessibility. But they do also come from your first population class, so don't think you're escaping from having to expand your nobles. You do have to expand them to get these guys. So that's really the trade-off when it comes to these guys. Now, you do get a far better late-game hoplite. So the game of Carthage is that you're going to have to wait like 120 turns to the 4X reforms, but you will get the best hoplite you can spam in the game. So it's kind of worth it taking the hit early on with these guys. And they are still really, really good. Like, while I do say that they're weaker than the elite hoplites of, say, Athens, of Rhodes, of Colchis, of Massilia, yeah, even Massilia. Even Massilia has a better elite hoplite that you get early on. Let's check them out just for the sake of comparison. Yeah, you get these Massilian Noble Guard. You can see 9, 19, 21, 26. The basic stuff, just 35 armor, akin to the Carthaginian Sacred Band, which again isn't very well armored. Most elite hoplites have 38 armor. Some of the best ones even have 41 armor, like the shield bearers of the Macedonians and Seleucids. But anyway, this is just an okay hoplite, but it totally will serve its purpose. And you know, amongst the African tribes, amongst the Iberian tribes, amongst the Romans who don't have great hoplites, these hoplites will shine. So they will still get the job done. It's just for not as good as some of the alternatives you find in other factions. Now, late game, you get the Sacred Band, and this is just totally an absolutely amazing hoplite, primarily because of melee defense. 22 melee defense is the highest like any hoplite has in the game. There's no hoplite that can compare to this. Even the Spartan Aspis unit has 21 melee defense rather than 22. Combine that with 56 base morale, which is extraordinarily good, and 38 armor, which, you know, it's not the highest in the game, but it's still a good number. This is just such a solid hoplite, just totally worth bringing. Brilliant unit, looks really cool, looks really bulky, looks really lethal. Just amazing, amazing unit. My number 1 pick for hoplite in the game when it comes to a unit you can just recruit in your regular army. And if you compare that to the Spartans, who obviously have amazing hoplites, their late game reformed hoplite is worse. 20 melee defense instead of a 22, but the Carthaginian one have 35 armor instead of the 38 armor, and the same base morale at 56. This is just a better unit, so it's totally worth bringing. Now, if you're a cavalry, you have 2 options. If you're a Carthaginian citizen cavalry, or your Sacred Band. Actually, no, you also get this General Bodyguard. I am mistaken. Now, the Carthaginian Citizen Cavalry, this comes about in the Furos reform, so turn 60. And it is a Lancer Cavalry. You know, 57 charge bonus is great, but there's way better Lancers in the game that has 60 charge bonus rather than the 57 of this Carthaginian Lancer. Also, the melee stats of this unit are pretty piss poor. Like 13 melee attack is good, although many Lancers have like a 15, I think. But 5 melee defense is abysmal. So in a long-term grind out with an opponent, these guys will typically get defeated by far weaker melee units. This unit does have 41 armor though, which is impressively bulky, meaning that these guys will weather skirmish shots far better than the average kind of like shieldless Lancer cavalry. Simultaneously, they have 7 speed, meaning these guys are quite maneuverable and brisky. Overall, a quite easy unit to make use of. They do have a heavy mass, meaning that they're great for cavalry charges. And these guys will work great in sync with your hoplites, allowing you to hammer an anvil in Alexandrian fashion. Just overall, a really useful unit, a cost-effective unit, totally worth bringing, but because you're putting your general in this unit, it is somewhat risky, because if these guys get caught by enemy melee cavalry, they might lose the melee engagement rather quickly because of these low offensive stats, and because of that, you might not want these guys as your general unit, but they do definitely deserve to be in your army. I'd recommend bringing them outside of your general. Instead, if you're gonna have to choose a cavalry, I choose this Carthaginian general bodyguard. Now, this unit's exclusively recruitable as your general, and it is less maneuverable than the last one because it has a slower speed, but overall, it's so much more stable. 38 armor, it's more mortal than the 41 armor of this one, but come on. Look at these actual combat stats. 10 melee attack, 17 melee defense, 50 charge bonus. This is just an extremely stable unit. And don't you want stability in your general? Besides that, 50 charge bonus will still make these guys quite useful for a hammer and anvil. 38 armor means that they're still defensible. This is just such a good, well-rounded unit. So I just think because of that, I totally believe in these guys as your general. I think that they are an apt general bodyguard. The Sacred Band Cavalry are also recruitable, but they're literally worse than your general bodyguard in almost every way. The only thing that they do better at is they have more armor and they have more morale, meaning that they're more defensive, but they have worse combat stats in every single category. And I favor combat stats above the defensive nature of a unit. I mean, sure, I guess that if you want your general to have the highest chance of survival, put them in the highest armored unit. Put them in a unit that won't run away as quickly. But I kind of just like the stat distribution of this general bodyguard more. But I guess it's just a preference thing. If you just feel like you want the more defensive unit, you really just don't want your general to die under any circumstance, bring these guys. Once you get into late game, you get an upgraded version of this unit. It's upgraded slightly. Like, it has somewhat better combat stats, as you can see, as it moves up. 1 more melee attack, 2 more charge, 1 more weapon damage, and it gives you 2 more armor. I mean, it does make this the best cavalry unit you have overall, but it's only a marginal improvement. It's not really crazy. But, going into late game, I would switch my choice from the General's Bodyguard to this Sacred Band Cavalry, the late game variant. It is just a better unit, undoubtedly. Get this if you really just want hammer and anvil capabilities, and get your infantry if you're more into a cheaper infantry general. Definitely for a defensive army, I would go with the infantry option. But these cavalry units are overall very stable. None of them are really powerhouse cavalry units, but they're all just stable options for your general, safe options for your general. Because of that, I do like the general options as Carthage. It's just really up to you to analyze this trade-off yourself and make the pick that you want. Now, for your melee infantry, you have a lot of options as Carthage. In my opinion, you don't have a lot of premium options, but you do have some cost-effective options. Going off from the very bottom, though, you do have an absolutely terrible option here with this Libyan infantry. I think that when I was showing them off on the campaign map, because they had an experience chevron, they looked deceptively good. But look at this melee attack. Look at this melee defense. Absolutely abysmal. 36 base morale is so low. They don't have a javelin volley. The only thing this unit can do, which is good, is they have a pretty crazy charge of 24. This is a high impact charge. And armor penetration of 12, but 16 weapon damage makes this armor penetration a little bit pointless, because they do just have very low weapon damage, meaning that when they do actually strike a hit on an opposing unit, they're not going to do a lot of damage, even if it will virtually ignore the enemy armor. And because this is a unit that's of such low caliber that you only expect to use them in early game, I feel like having this high armor penetration isn't super valuable, because enemy units will most likely not have the highest armor themselves. The only high armor early game units are going to encounter are going to be against the Romans and the Syracusans most likely, and their units will have such better stats just across the board, be of a higher class than this. But I really just don't see the use for these Libyan infantry. I personally see these guys as a massive weak link in an army when you make one. Unless you spam these guys in abundance to just make an incredibly cheap army, and you just kind of have one of those really cheap armies that you try to min-max for, I wouldn't really use these in any composition. They're just so bad. And whenever I fought Carthage as the Romans, or really any faction I've ever fought the Carthaginians with, whenever I saw these guys on the field, I just charged them and they would rout immediately. These guys will let you down in anything but a rear charge. So ultimately, I wouldn't really use them even though you don't have a lot of shock infantry, and these guys do have shock capabilities with the charge bonus of 24. I just don't see these guys as all too valuable, and I wouldn't bring them in an army. Moving on to your first mercenary unit, you have these mercenary Iberian swordsmen. These guys are recruitable from your level 1 mercenary barrack, and they're just okay. These guys represent the weakest troops that you could really have of like barbarian low-tier swordsmen. You know, these guys come from the barbarian freedman class. These guys are farmers with weapons. These guys are seasonal warriors who bring their own gear into battle and then go home back to their wife, back to their farm, and then eke out a living as a rather poor person. You know, they're light in stature. They have 225 men. They do have okay-ish combat stats, but with some noticeable weakness. Mainly low morale at 39. Anything under 40 is going to be quite easy to rout, so don't depend on these guys too much. 10 armor, which is rather low. You know, 23 weapon damage is okay, but far weaker than any elite or mid-tier sword would have. 6 melee defense means these guys kind of go down quite readily in battle. When you combine it with only 10 armor and 39 morale, that kind of spells a somewhat dubious picture for these guys. Like, they can definitely rout pretty quickly because they'll lose men quite quickly. 15 charge bonus means that while they can pack a hit on the punch, it won't be a particularly powerful one. This is a very low charge bonus for a sword. The only good thing about these guys is that they have 12 melee attack, meaning that they hit quite often, and 23 weapon damage, while not great, is still pretty okay. It's pretty good. And these guys are very cheap. You can see here, 675 is so little. I think that these guys cost like between 80 and 90 to actually maintain, and it costs almost nothing to recruit. So these guys are ultimately a very cost-effective army unit to make like the main line of in like a weak army. In a weak army, you totally can make these guys your main line if you're just trying to go for like a min-max thing. In an elite Carthaginian army, I would never bring these guys because they're just not very good. They just don't hit that hard. You know, if you're really kind of struggling for cash when you're rounding out what was an expensive army, you can maybe justify bringing 2 of these guys and just place them in your main line. I wouldn't place them on the flanks because of the low melee defense, low armor, and low morale. I feel like if they get hit from the rear by anything, they will rout. Your flanks need to be guarded by your spears. But, you know, having a couple of these in your main line won't kill your army, and they do have 3 speed and 1 javelin volley, so you know, they're good enough for the price. They're actually a bit better than I think the price justifies. Now, come turn 30, you get the Libyan furrows. Sorry, turn 60, when the furrows reforms hit for all the Greek factions, you get these Libyan furrows infantry. And these guys are more or less identical to the furrows units used by the Greeks. So a couple of differences that I'm going to show you here. If we look at a generic Pharos unit, say the one that you get as the Ptolemies, you can see here, actually the Ptolemies don't get generic Pharos swordsmen, my bad, I think the Seleucids, they do. Yeah, here we go, your generic Pharos swordsmen. You can see that these guys have only 8 armor. The Carthaginian one has 15 armor, but otherwise the exact same stats. These guys are more or less a hybrid skirmisher. You know, they have 23 weapon damage, 9 melee attack, and 14 melee defense, meaning that they can do damage in a melee, but they're not going to be amazing. Like, these are not elite unit stats, and what really makes them crappy is 13 charge bonus. That is abysmally low, but they do come with 3 javelins, and when you recruit them in the game and you get the customary 1 experience chevron you tend to get with units, these guys will have 4 javelins. So these guys truly are hybrid skirmishers. Combine that with the 4 speed, and yeah, you really get an image that these guys are hybrid skirmishers. You position them behind your main line, you throw the 4 javelins, and then you get them in. Don't let them get charged by enemy units. If they get charged, they'll lose because their charge is so bad. They just won't be able to match the enemy charge unless it's a very similar style unit. But that's really all that it is to these guys. They're slightly better. You could totally bring these guys. Because of the javelins, you know, you could bring them instead of bringing missile infantry if you want to buff up your main line in general. These guys are also rather cost effective, you know, they are rather cheap, and they come from your third population class, so they're pretty easy to get. Now moving on, you also have Libya Phoenician Furos Infantry, and while these guys are considered a Furos Infantry, they actually come from the 4-axe reform. You get them turn 120, and by turn 120, these guys are a little bit outdated, in fact a lot outdated. By turn 120, you're going to be facing late game armies across the field, and I just don't feel like this unit has the capacity to keep up. Mainly because they only have one volley of javelins, meaning that they're no longer a skirmish capable unit. They do have 3 speed, which is pretty good for a unit with 30 armor. Like 3 speed, 30 armor, these things don't tend to go together. And when you look at the overall combat ability of this unit, this is still very early game combat ability, very mid game at the latest combat ability. And against like barbarian factions and against the Romans and against even like anything other than the Hellenic factions, which have crappy infantry in general, like crappy melee infantry, these guys won't really hold their own. So unless you're fighting against the Hellenes, I wouldn't really justify bringing them because I just feel like they'll get outclassed. Like this isn't on its own a horrible unit, particularly for the price, but I just be careful because these combat stats are really weak, especially the 13 charge bonus and the 23 weapon damage. These 2 stats make them like really bad, like worse than 4-axe swords, who are already kind of bad. They do cost very little, as you can see the 1075 would justify, so if they're going to be cost effective maybe, but they'll get run over by so much. Now moving on to the next unit here, you have the mercenary Scutari, and these guys are kind of akin to like early game mid-tier barbarian swords. Like they're going to be similar to the Boii medium swordsmen. They're going to be pretty similar to the Lusitani heavy swordsmen. They're going to be pretty similar to the early game Arverni Oathsworn. The only difference is that while these guys do have great combat ability, I mean you can see here, right, 28 weapon damage compared to your Libya Furos infantry that only has 23. Sure, the melee attack and defense adds up to a lower number, but you also have a far better charge bonus. Just the stats that matter are better for this unit. You know, weapon damage does so much, guys. Don't underestimate weapon damage. But the only weakness of this unit is the 25 armor. It's a little bit subpar. It also is a rather slow unit moving at a 2 speed, but it does get 1 volley of javelin, and sometimes these type of swordsmen don't get their javelin volley. So that in of itself is quite good. Like, this is a good unit, particularly for early to mid-game. I wouldn't use them in late game. I feel like the Scutari will be outperformed by late game infantry from good infantry factions. But these guys also represent an infantry unit that's far better than a lot of Hellenic factions get access to, as well as Eastern factions. So against the right opponent, these guys can still be useful into late game, but against a good sword faction, you know, all the sword faction, the barbarian ones at least, for the most part, get a unit like this. And that unit will get replaced by a far better version turn 90. So because of that, you know, be cautious about bringing these guys into the late game against barbarians. They probably will get outskilled. Now your Libya Phoenician 4-axe swordsman is pretty much identical to the 4-axe swordsman that almost every single faction gets, just across the Greek world. The 4-axe swordsman is pretty much ubiquitous. The Phoenician variant is pretty much the same. They all have like 38 armor, which you see the Phoenician one has. Actually, the Phoenician one has slightly more base morale than the Fenian one that I saw, but the combat stats are the same. And the combat stats for 4-axe swordsmen are really bad. Really, really bad. Like, they'll do well enough against Eastern factions because they have terrible infantry too, but this represents a really bad late game sword. Like, any barbarian faction will beat these swordsmen hands down. The Romans will obliterate these swordsmen too. And your own choices are better. Like, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, I take this mercenary Scutari over this unit because the weapon damage is higher, the charge bonus is higher. Sure, these guys do have like better defensive capabilities, but simultaneously this unit's so expensive, man. These guys are going to cost like 200 something to maintain on the field. They're going to be a very expensive unit for you to have. They also come from your second population class too, so they're not exactly free to recruit, while these guys come from your subjects. So in all honesty, these 2 units are just way more cost effective than the Phoenician Libyan stuff you're getting. In these fees, Libya and Furos infantry kind of have a role as like an alternative skirmish option, something that can help beef up your main line by being a bit of a hybrid. But these guys are, in my opinion, useless, particularly because these mercenary Iberian factions are an option. Now, these guys are very, very weird. Like, you don't see any other units in Divide et Impera that have 18 melee attack and 9 melee defense, except I think maybe the Marians have something like this, like the warrior monks or something. But this is a very, very unique grouping of stats to have. And because of that, I just had to test whether they're good or not. I tested them against Galatian chosen swordsmen, you know, which are pretty much like a weaker version of elite Gallic swordsmen. I tested them against Arverni champions, I tested them against Syracusan heavy infantry, and I tested them against early game Roman Praetorians. And my conclusion about these guys is that they can compete. They can totally compete against pretty much like the elite melee infantry across the factions. I feel like they're a little bit worse though. Like, they can compete, but they're a little bit worse. These guys got absolutely slaughtered by the Syracusan heavy infantry as well as the late game Praetorians of the Romans. But they did beat the Galatians. Although my test wasn't perfect, my line was slightly longer, and I think that had a pretty significant impact on the outcome. But what I don't like about these guys, which I think makes them a little bit less versatile, is that they only have this 9 melee attack, and they actually have significantly less missile block chance because their shields are very small. So if these guys get shot up by skirmishers, they can get far easily obliterated than the more heavy, kind of safer options for elite swords that you get with the other factions, like the Galatians, the Arverni, the Romans. They have far safer faction swordsmen that can just absorb missile fire at a far more successful rate than these guys. Simultaneously, these guys also have pretty bad morale for an elite sword. 48 morale is pretty low for an elite infantry, actually. Most elite swordsmen have like 52, 54. So in all the tests I ran, this unit started wavering first. Combine that with the low melee defense, meaning that if these guys get flanked, they actually will take severe casualties. Because flanking lowers your melee defense significantly, and these guys don't have much to go to begin with. So because of that, I feel like these guys, they're a little bit squishier, while at the same time not being much better in melee combat, because these guys only have 26 weapon damage. Your typical elite sword will have either 28 or 30. That's the standard, so 26 is low. Your melee attack, which is really high at 18, compensates for this somewhat, but this keeps these guys from being god tier in a grind. And this will make them lose against, say, the Syracusan heavy infantry, which butchered these guys. Now, the Syracusan heavies are only available in turn 120, while these guys are available pretty early on, but they do come from your highest tier mercenary barracks, so it will take you like 40, 50 turns to get them, but you still get them like halfway through the game. As long as you just make sure to be, you know, getting military technology. You know, if you just focus completely on civil, sure, you won't get these guys for a while, but if you want them, you could totally get them like turn 50, turn 60. So because of that, you know, you get these guys like halfway through compared to a lot of elites that come later. So considering that, like, these guys are very, very good. Very, very solid. Super great option. Don't bring these 4x swords at all when you have these guys to go. This is just such a better unit. And they come from your third population class, so totally worthwhile. But definitely not the best melee unit in the game. And, you know, because these guys, like I mentioned, there's limitations, skirmish fire, they're not going to be good on the flanks, because if they get outflanked, they just get wrecked, low morale, stuff like that. You know, these guys kind of keep the melee infantry of Carthage at a good, but not great level. You know, very good compared to the other Hellenic factions. I can't think of a single regular Hellenic faction that has better melee units than these guys. You know, maybe only the Ptolemies, which are more of like a Hellenistic faction. I kind of like that distinction. The Ptolemies has better melee infantry and spear infantry, in my opinion, but compared to the Greek factions, and I kind of considered Phoenicians kind of amongst the Greeks stylistically, I would say that the Carthaginians have one of the best melee infantry lines, but compared to the barbarians and the Romans, they in general are weaker. Not by just a tad, but by a moderate amount weaker. Now moving on to your spears, the Carthaginians have really cost-effective spears, but not great spears. You start out with your mercenary African levies who are cheap as dirt, but not very good. Extremely low melee stats, 6 and 12. Stat line is about as bad as spears can get. They do have one volley of javelins and are exceptionally cheap. The price is really the main point of these guys. We're just not very good alongside that. But if you're trying to make a really cheap army, you can justify having a couple of these on the flanks to ward off cavalry. Your Libyan spearmen are going to be slightly more armored, but they're going to lose the javelins, making these guys honestly not better than your African levies. I'd prefer having a volley of javelins than having 8 armor when my morale is horrible at 33. Like 33 is as bad as morale can get for an infantry unit, basically. This is like garbage skirmisher tier morale. So I really don't think that these units are worth bringing. I would prefer your mercenary Africans, but you get these guys out of your tier 1 barrack, I guess, so you kind of have more accessibility to this. But anyway, these are both terrible units. You don't have to think about them much. Now, your Libyan furrow spears, you get these turn 60 with the Furrows reforms, and these guys have the same stat line as generic Greek Furrow spears, with the one little difference that these guys only have 15 armor. Regular Furrow spears have 20 armor. The other difference is that this unit is a light spear infantry, while your regular Furrow spear is a medium spear infantry. Because of that, this unit is worse than Furrow spears. Now, this unit is still useful because Furrow spears are an exceptionally useful, stable unit. You know, you have these guys on your flanks, or you have these guys as your main line in an army, but you're just trying to get like a cheap but decent army together for mid-game. This unit is also coming from your third population class, so they are pretty easy to recruit. But in all honesty, this is not a particularly great Furrow spear unit, but it's weaker than the Greek one to an extent where this one's still useful. It's still useful, even though it's a bit weaker objectively. It still has its uses, sure. So you can bring them, but you know, don't expect a ton out of these guys. They're just a nice, stable unit. Now, out of your barrack pool, your mercenary barrack pool, you get these mercenary Celtic spearmen, and you do get them with your level 1 barrack. And that's really the good thing about these guys. It's accessibility. These guys have the same stat line as Furrow spears, making them kind of ahead of your time, considering that you can get these guys like 10 turns into a campaign. They'll totally do better than Libyan spearmen. You know, if you're fighting against, other faction in Mauritania, the guys I advise to attack first, if you bring a lot of these, they will butcher the enemy spearmen because they'll have more armor. They'll totally hang amongst the more militia spear units of the Iberians, but they'll get beaten by the warrior spears. But, you know, they'll do good against the militia, who are often like 6 and 12 warriors. But in general, this unit's not great. One, because 39 base morale is pretty low. 15 armor, while good, is not great. And, while they have 1 javelin, but doesn't really compensate for the weaker armor and morale. But, you know, the combat stats is like that of a mid-tier spear, which makes these guys useful, cost-effective, you know, good in the early game, but as you go into late game, the armor and low morale will absolutely hold them back, and you'll cease using them, except maybe as a deterrent for cavalry on the flanks. But honestly, the Libyan Furrow spear is better, has better morale, and it's cheaper. So once you get to turn 60, and if you have both barracks, you know, the mercenary and the Libyan barrack in one province, go for the Libyan Furrow spear. They also come from the same population class. They come from the 3rd tier population. So this unit, it's good until you get this unit. Then this unit should replace these guys, because there's literally no reason to get the mercenary Celtic spearmen. It's worse in every single way, as in the only difference between them is that these guys are cheaper and this one has less morale. So get it. And the mercenary Ligurian spearmen are actually good because they have elite spear stats. These guys are basically akin in stats to an elite hoplite. The only difference is that they don't have a formation, they're medium, and they have 20 armor. But you get access to them so early into the game, like you get them the same time, but you get these mercenary Celtic spearmen like 10 turns in, as long as you focused on getting your first military technology right away. These guys are great, dude. 18 charge bonus, 22 weapon damage, looking at this one, 24 weapon damage, 19 charge bonus, 8 melee attack, 19 melee defense. Just a great unit. Not an absurdly overpowered unit, but a great unit. And really, it's as close as you're going to get to an elite melee unit come like by turn 10. So if you have a couple of these on your flanks, you're going to be solid. You're going to be slaughtering Iberians and Libyan factions, as well as, these guys can pack a punch against the Romans. Like, these guys are just a solid spear fighting warrior unit. Totally good. They're basically like higher end Celtic warriors compared to this lackluster spearmen that come in these guys. Now moving on, you have your Libya Phoenician furrow spears. These guys come turn 120. Okay, this is a 4x unit, and for a 4x unit, I feel like these guys are a little bit outdated because they're basically just a Freo spear. Like, combat wise, have the exact same combat stats as this Celtic spearman and this Libyan furrow spear. Are considerably more expensive. They come from your second population class. The only good thing about this is that they have 30 armor and 225 men. This is a good lackluster unit in late game to have on your flanks, because these guys will deter cavalry, they'll be solid, they'll hold the line, 225 men, as well as a medium mass will just make sure that these guys can kind of hold the line and just be like a solid deterrent. Like, I feel like having one of these on each flank will be totally acceptable in the best late game army that you bring, for just a good support unit, but they're not a killer unit. If you make an entire army of these at turn 120, you'd better hope that your enemy has not invested too much in their army, for, the more lackluster combat stats of this unit will impact its ability to fight off its foe. Now, moving on to your mercenary naked spear thrower, this is a very unique unit to Carthage, and they do come with your level 4 mercenary barracks, so you'd have to wait till like turn 60 if you've gone very heavy into military technology and upgrading your barracks. Now, this unit has only 1 armor, so they're exceptionally risky to bring. Combine that with only 3 speed, and this unit, they can get caught and they can get slaughtered. Now, this unit is an absolute grinding fiend, though. 10 melee attack is pretty good for a spear. 23 melee defense is crazy. I haven't seen any other unit with 23 melee defense, I'm going to be real. This unit, just a melee defense goat. 22 charge bonus is pretty good. That's really good for a melee unit. I mean, sure, it's not like a Romphia unit. It's not a Falx unit. It's not as good as some of the naked warriors that the Celts have. But 28 weapon damage is amongst the highest. This is elite. Weapon damage tends to only go up to like 30. I think there's maybe a unit that has like 32, like a really rare, like a Marian unit, or maybe like a Thracian unit or something. But, 28 is still really good. And having 28 melee defense to accompany just all of these amazing combat stats is just insane. Like, these guys are great at combat. Also, bonusers cavalry. 20 bonusers cavalry is crazy. They will obliterate cavalry. The only weakness, though, is that it's the 1 armor. If you shoot these guys enough, they will absolutely die. You shoot them from the flank, they are dead. 51 base morale also is not crazy for one of these units. I've seen like naked style warriors of like 60 morale. 51 is good, it's elite, but it's not the top tier of elite. So kind of watch out with what you're getting with these guys. They're called spear throwers, but they only have 2 volleys of javelins, so only 1 more than normal. The real combat prowess is getting them into a grind fight. It's just with 1 armor, you always know that they're going to die. You always know that they're going to die when entering combat, but they come from your 3rd population class, like all other mercenaries. So you don't really have to worry about them dying too much. You can always replenish them. You can always recruit them. So totally a worthwhile unit to bring. Just make sure that they don't get too heavily impacted in a skirmish. Your enemy can theoretically charge them down with cavalry, but they better not leave for cavalry in with these guys for too long, because the 20 bonus versus cavalry will shred your opponent. But they are very light, so say like if your enemy hits them with like a cataphract and then runs away, these guys are done for type thing. You also have 4x spears. These guys are generic 4x spears. They're akin to the 4x spears that the other Greek factions get. There's really nothing to talk about here. They're kind of mediocre because of their low weapon damage, as well as melee attack only being 8. Their melee defense is good, so they can't hold out in a while, but this isn't really a unit that will kill elite swords or anything like that. Just overall kind of a lackluster unit. These guys are they're a replica of the Greek unit, and the Greek unit really isn't that good. Just overall, I feel like going into late game, if you can actually utilize them properly, these mercenary naked spear throwers will actually be far more effective. And your hoplites are just better, so I would really use these 4x spears, because 4x spears are lackluster, but your hoplite line is so freaking good but I'd always keep your hoplites as your main line. I would never switch to these guys as your main line ever. So there's overall really isn't a whole lot of purpose to have these in your roster. It's just, you know, you can have a spear line going into early and mid game, and going into late game you might want to have some of these mercenary naked spear throwers kind of come in as like your X factor, your like shock factor for your army, and maybe a couple of these Phoenician Phrao spears on your flanks to be a nice solid cavalry deterrent. Now moving on to your phalanxes, you have some really cool and unique phalanxes as the Carthaginians. You start out with your Libyan hoplites, and these guys are basically a buffed up militia hoplite. Let's go look at a regular militia hoplite to understand why. We pull up, Epirus here. You can see that their militia hoplite right here has 6 melee attack, 12 melee defense, 15 armor, 36 morale. Your Libyan hoplite will have 7 melee attack, 1 more than the Epirode, 14 melee defense, 2 more than the Epirode, same armor. Let's see, I think morale is the same. Yes, morale is the same. So it's like a slight advantage combat-wise over that of the Epirode. Actually, what about, yeah, charge bonus and weapon damage is less as well. So yeah, these guys are just in general better, although the limited armor makes these guys somewhat weak. They're also only a light unit, but they have the same movement speed as any other hoplite, meaning that you don't really get to benefit from the flexibility of a light unit. You only get to suffer from how much easier they are to flatten by cavalry and all of that type of thing. But as overall, you can find a use for these guys. They also come from preferred population class, and they're super easy to recruit. So against African opposition, against maybe Iberians that don't have spearmen but fight in like a spear wall, these guys can be useful. Against the Romans, these guys will be a liability because the Roman phalanxes as well as Roman infantry will just outclass these guys weight-wise. So don't use these guys against factions that actually have really good heavy infantry. Just don't. But you can use them against factions that don't have good heavy infantry, and this will just be kind of a cost-saving precaution from your end. So that's kind of the use. Like against Africans, Iberians, maybe even Celts, like barbarian factions, you can find a use for these guys, but never use them against the Romans, Greeks, and Greek factions. Your Carthaginian hoplites are kind of a letdown because they just have generic hoplite stats, like absolutely generic, like literally the same as this hoplite, stat by stat by stat. Literally no difference, other than morale actually. I just noticed one. Combat stats are the same, but they have slightly less morale than the Epirode hoplite I showed you here. The Epirode hoplite is a generic hoplite in every single way. The other thing is that this Carthaginian hoplite comes from your first class. They are such a weak unit to come from your noble class, so totally not worth bringing. Just not worth bringing in general. But you don't have a better option until you get to turn 60, unless you're willing to pay more and bring your Sacred Band, or until you get your mercenary Greek hoplites. But I would totally just bring mercenary Greek hoplites over these, and I'll explain why. But first I want to cover these mercenary heavy Celtic spearmen. Now this is a good heavy Celtic spearmen because they have elite combat stats. You know, they have the 8 and 19, which is exactly what you'd want. This is as good as Celtic spearmen can get. These guys also have 30 armor, which is almost as good as Celtic spearmen can get. Just overall great stat lines, but these guys, you do have to wait quite long to get them because they come from your level 4 mercenary barrack, meaning you're going to be, again, like waiting till turn 60, and that's if you prioritize military innovation with your technological research. So because of that, it will take a while for you to get these, and while these guys do offer better combat stats than the hoplites, their shield wall is far worse than the hoplite wall because the shield wall can't move nearly as easily. It's kind of like a stationary thing where your guys just kind of link their shields together and just stand in a wall, while the hoplite's more dynamic. It can push, it can retreat, the men actually travel together. So because of that, this unit, it's kind of better if you want a more maneuverable unit. Like you can put these guys on the flanks, while hoplites, you never put them on the flanks. They just die on the flanks. Because these guys don't even need to be in formation. Like they're just a good spear unit in general. Unlike the hoplites, which are not a super good spear unit in general. But, you know, outside of that, I wouldn't really see much of a use for these. Now, your mercenary Greek hoplites have better stats than your Carthaginian hoplites. They have 5 more armor and more morale, while also posing the exact same combat stats. The problem, though, problem, though, is that these guys are pretty expensive. They are more overpriced than other factions' hoplites, but they also come from your third population class. And to get such a good unit from the third population class is just unheard of amongst the Hellenic factions, with the exception of Spartan guest hoplites, making these a uniquely great unit for the Carthaginians and totally worth getting if you can afford them. I feel as the Carthaginians, it's easier to come up with money than it is to come up with pure-blooded Phoenicians to stand in the line. So I'd far prefer to just bring mercenary Greeks and, benefit from the quality of the Greeks than bring these crappy Carthaginians. I wouldn't recruit these guys unless you're really in a pickle and you just need to recruit men. Like, literally, get these unless you don't have the money. That's the best option. If you're like, you just failed in the battle against the Romans and you have like one more turn and you're trying to get the best units you can to defend Carthage with, you bring the Carthaginians. But if you don't need to do that, bring the Greeks. Bring them when you're prosperous. Now, turn 60, you get these amazing and wonderful Libby Phoenician hoplites. They're heavy phalanx, but look at the stats. 35 armor, above average for a hoplite. 8 melee attack, 17 melee defense. These guys have the exact same stat line as your Sacred Band with the exception of a bit less morale, which is just really, really, really good. I absolutely love these Libyan Phoenician hoplites, and they pose another step on the hoplite rung, the hoplite ladder when it comes to quality that virtually no Hellenic factions get. Very, very few factions get a Phraeus-inspired hoplite. Really only the Massilians alongside the Carthaginians, as far as I'm aware, as well as the Spartans. And those are hoplite specialist factions. So this is just a super duper good unit. It'll beat the hoplites of Athens. It'll beat the hoplites of most Hellenic factions. It'd just be a super duper solid mid-line unit. Once you get to turn 60, I would convert my entire hoplite line to this unit if you can afford it, because it's just super duper duper good, and unlike the Sacred Band, you don't need to expand your first population. And we've already talked about these two Sacred Bands. This one, it's very easily accessible because you do get them once you upgrade Carthage to, your tier 2 barrack. And because these Carthaginian hoplites come from the same exact class is the Sacred Band, there's almost no reason to bring the Carthaginian hoplites. Like, you're either going to bring these guys because you have the money and you don't want to expend that Phoenician population, or you're expending your Phoenician population and you're bringing the Carthaginian Sacred Band, since they are an upgrade on your mercenary Greeks. These guys are an actual serviceable elite hoplite. But once you get into late game, you get a way better version. You get the best hoplite in the game outside of a couple of generals for Sparta and Macedon. Just such a good unit. Absolutely amazing unit. They really represent that the Carthaginians are truly an empire, and they do have a militaristically capable unit that can serve as the bedrock of their late game. A unit that they can conquer the world with, because this is just the best hoplite. So strong, so impervious to damage, just an absolute beast of a unit, and one of the best units I've ever seen at absorbing ammunition too. Just an absolute beast. Everything that you want a hoplite to be, this unit has. Now, your missiles as Carthage are exceptionally strong. I would say that Carthage is one of the strongest missile factions. You have a great variation between strong hybrid kind of like skirmish infantry units, as well as some exceptionally good skirmish units and very cost-effective low-tier units. Your low tier started with Libyan javelin men. This isn't a good unit, but it's a very cheap unit. Very, very cheap. And they have better skirmish capabilities than, say, like the generic Greek javelin men, which you can see here. Actually, they have the same exact skirmish capabilities as the Greek javelin men, but I believe that they're cheaper. Yeah, they are cheaper, while offering the exact same stat line, pretty much. But this unit sucks at melee. This unit absolutely sucks at melee. They don't have any armor penetration and, low stats all around. Only 8 charge bonus is pathetic. They're really just for throwing javelins, and then they die. That's what they do. But they're literally one of the cheapest units in the game, so you can't really complain. Like, if you're trying to defend like a minor settlement desperately, or you're trying to make the most cost-effective unit, like army you can out of like, I don't know, mercenary African levies, Libyans, Iberians, that type of thing, then this unit will serve alongside those men remarkably well. If you want an upgrade, you can get the mercenary Numidian javelin. These guys will come from your mercenary barrack, and these guys are just better across the board. They actually have some melee capabilities with 18 melee damage and 10 charge bonus. They shoot faster They shoot the javelins faster, and the javelins are elite javelins, coming in at 22 missile damage and 90 range. This unit's also just very cost effective too. This is not by any means an expensive unit. These guys cost like, I don't know, like 60 or something, or super duper cheap, and their javelins do insane damage. Also, notice that this is a 150-man unit. This unit's actually exceptionally good, and while they are definitely a unit capable of getting killed by any enemy skirmishers, I mean, only 30 base morale, 1 armor, they also do come with a little armor, a little, not armor, but a little shield. A little tiny hide shield, so just exceptionally good. Now, moving on, you also have Libyan archers. These guys are akin to the generic Greek archers, meaning that they are just really, really, really good, cheap, cost-effective archers. Like I showed on the campaign map, they cost like 70. So, you know, if you want a cheap archer, go for these guys. Your Libyan slingers are not very good, though, because they don't have a shield. And because they don't have a shield, they're not going to be particularly good. You know, with only 1 armor, that's just too risky in my opinion. I wouldn't really bring these guys, but believe me, you'll have better slinger options moving on. The Sardinian archers, they are a area of recruitment unit, so don't count them as part of the roster. As part of your regular roster, from turn 60, you get the Libyan Peltas. These guys are an upgrade on the Libyan Javelin Men and mercenary Numidian Javelin Men. These guys are pretty good, but they are pretty much a lot, like they are kind of like a crappy replica of like Greek Peltas. And I say crappy because they only have 10 armor. They do elite skirmish damage, and they do have some decent melee attributes, but the melee attributes actually, they are just okay. Like, they're actually akin to your Freo swordsman, meaning that they're not amazing. Overall, I feel like this unit's a little bit overpriced for what they give you. Like, this is reasonably good, like, reasonably defensive, you know, reasonably good at melee, you know, obviously really, really good javelins, but at the end of the day, I feel like you kind of overpay. I'd much rather take the mercenary Numidian Javelin. I'm sure this unit's not as good in melee, but they're like half the price. Come to Thorax reforms, you get the Libby Phoenician Peltas, which are better, but still not great. Like, they have good armor, but still really bad melee stats. Like, both of these units can kill because the javelins are really good, but ultimately, you just don't do particularly well when it comes to the other things, the actual melee component, making this a poor hybrid. Now, moving on to your mercenary Balearic Slinger, this unit's an absolute beast, absolute monster. Bring these guys, you'll have so much fun with them. Unlike other slingers that only shoot 5 shots per minute, these guys beef up to a nice 6 shot per minute, which actually is acceptable. 13 missile damage from a slinger is exceptionally good. It brings it close to an archer, but 215 range is like absurd. 215 range is crazy. Now, these guys aren't good in melee, mind you, and the problem with this slinger is that if they get charged by an enemy cavalry unit, you kind of will lose out here on the value this unit can provide, because it will take a while, but if you save these guys into late game, they're just invaluable, because if the enemy cavalry is no longer around, and believe me, you have the cavalry tools to be able to wipe out the enemy cavalry yourself, this unit is just going to do so freaking well for you going into late game, man. We're just going to be so damn effective, so damn offensive, so good just across the board. It's just amazing. Like, one of the best skirmishers in the game, one of the best at skirmishing. But unlike a lot of elite skirmishers, this unit doesn't really have hybrid value. They won't really do all that well in a melee. Now, moving on to a more hybrid skirmisher, you have Carthaginian archers. And they're definitely a hybrid because their actual skirmish ability does not exceed the Libyan archer. The only thing that will make this thing better at skirmishing than the Libyan is that it does have better armor, so it'll be better at taking enemy fire, but the 165 range is kind of a limitation on such an elite unit. Simultaneously, these guys come from your first population, from your noble class, and I'm really hesitant to expend nobles on these. I'd much rather spend them on your elite hoplites, because like these guys are going to be so useful in late game, and of course your cavalry, a lot of which does come from your noble class. I'd really not feel like using them on a Carthaginian archers is a priority, but if you look at their melee stats, that's where you really get the value from these guys. Like 10 melee attack and 13 melee defense is so good for an archer. 15 charge is really good for an archer. 25 weapon damage is good for an archer. These guys just pull out swords and become effective swordsmen. That's all it really is for this. Not like amazing late game swordsmen, but by the attributes that you judge a mid game or early game sword, these guys are very competitive performance wise. So definitely use them for that. And that's really how to summarize your missile infantry. A good hybrid option, an amazing kind of like elite skirmish option, and then extremely cost-effective low-tier javelins, as well as archers, as well as somewhat lackluster slingers in mid-tier peltas, I would say. But the archers, the elite slingers, and the low-tier javelins of Carthage absolutely are great and make it one of the best skirmish factions in the game. Now, when it comes to your cavalry as Carthage, you're by no means one of the best cavalry factions in the game, but you are a very cost-effective cavalry faction. You don't have powerhouse options, but the options that you do have are very good bang for buck, generally very well armored. Outside of your lower tier cavalry, you have a lot of really kind of high armor, very survivable cavalry that honestly is quite versatile on the battlefield. Like in general, your cavalry are kind of like jack of all trades type of cavalry that are very survivable. But you don't have the power cavalry. You don't have like the killing power of good Seleucid cavalry, Macedonian cavalry, you know, stuff like that. It's just the cavalry that you have is good bang for buck. Now the first unit that you have here are the Libyan cavalry. And these guys are quite good, for the price of course. They come with 90 men in a unit, so even though these combat stats aren't exceptional, they do have to be a little bit worse to compensate for the killing power of having 15 more men in the unit. And honestly, 8 and 11 is really good for the price of these cavalry. They cost like under 200 to maintain. And these guys are just going to be exceptionally good at killing skirmishers since they have a good charge bonus, pretty decent melee attack and defense. They're also going to be pretty good in a cavalry on cavalry fight, particularly if this unit charges in second. You know, take the charge of the enemy cavalry with one of your more armored units, then wrap these guys around and hit them in the rear. That's the best way to use these guys in a cavalry on cavalry engagement. Now, because of their low armor and low mass, these guys won't do well in a prolonged engagement against enemy infantry. But considering the price of these units, and considering that they come from your third population class and they're available from turn 1, this is just an excellent unit, and Carthaginian light cavalry historically was excellent, so this plays well into Carthage's strengths and is just a great and useful unit that you're probably going to use these guys throughout your game. They'll always serve some purpose throughout your campaign. Now, when it comes to your mercenaries, you do have a Iberian cavalry option, and just like the Libyans, these guys have 90 men. Now, they will be a little bit more expensive, like even though in custom game they're of equal cost, on the actual campaign map they are more expensive, and honestly with good cause. Like, they have more armor by 5, and a higher mass, and they are the exact same speed as the Libyans, which is honestly quite surprising considering their higher mass. But the primary weakness that they have compared to the Libyans is 2 less melee defense, but frankly, considering that they have more armor and more morale, I do consider these mercenary Iberians a slight upgrade on the Libyans, but not an extensive one. Not one that's truly going to define these guys as a unit and make them significantly better by any means, but just a slight one. But if you find that your Libyans are dying a little bit too quickly, then I would definitely employ these Iberians as a replacement. Now, the thing is that the rest of your cavalry outside of these other mercenaries, is mercenary Iberian heavy cavalry, all these other cavalry come from your tier 1 population. So this is really where the bulk of your nobles should be spent alongside your hoplites. So do consider that some of these cavalry are going to take quite a few of your nobility to create, and that can have its troubles in the game. You know, if you become overly reliant on noble cavalry, then you might not be able to recruit them in an army when you really need them. But anyway, one of these noble cavalries are this Carthaginian citizen cavalry, and truly, I don't think that this is a very good unit. The only good thing about this unit is that despite having a medium mass, it does have a 7 speed, which is quite good. This is a quite quick unit. However, this 4 melee defense is such an eyesore 43 base morale is quite poor. 54 charge bonus is bad for a lancer. And this is a lancer. This isn't your typical melee citizen cavalry. No, this is just a really bad Alexandrian-style shock cavalry, which is maybe a little bit well armored for like an early game unit, but otherwise lacks the actual shock capabilities of a good lancer. 54 charge bonus is terrible. 11 melee attack and 4 melee defense is just bad. I mean, these guys are serviceable, and with ample support from your spearmen and from your light cavalry can deliver an effective hammer and anvil, because 54 charge is 54 charge. Doesn't matter what's delivering it, that type of charge bonus will be quite good. But at the end of the day, I really don't think that this is a unit that's going to help you all that much. The only good thing about it is that it is pretty cheap. It is pretty cost effective. But if I'm going to be completely honest, this isn't a unit that's actually going to assist you on the battlefield beyond early game. Will very quickly become outdated, but you do get the better version of it come turn 60 with the Pharaoh's reforms, so it's ultimately not a huge problem, but these guys aren't the best. You just have to wait for turn 60 and you actually get a shock cavalry that's worth considering. Now moving on to your other Pharaoh's unit that you get actually, it's these Libby Phoenician cavalry. And this is honestly a quite decent cavalry. Very, very stable. 9 melee attack and 15 melee defense. 48 charge bonus isn't great, but not terrible. 49 morale isn't great, but not terrible. 38 armor is quite serviceable. And 7 speed is better than average for a unit like this. They're also heavy in mass. This Libby Phoenician cavalry is honestly quite decent and worth recruiting. They also come from your second population class, which makes them honestly even more worth recruiting. At least you don't have to spend your nobles getting these guys. It's totally a great unit. I think a very stable unit, a very versatile unit, a sustainable unit to recruit in terms of cost and in terms of just how much value you get out of them in a battle. They will get trampled by like elite cavalry, don't get me wrong, but this is just a great mid-tier cavalry that I feel will punch a little bit above its weight. And moving on to your Carthaginian citizen cavalry, these are the late variants I was talking about, and this is honestly a quite good unit because it maintains the 7 speed of its lighter predecessor while simultaneously being heavy rather than the medium mass of its citizen. And you upgrade your mediocre 54 charge bonus to 57, which is actually getting stronger now. Plus you get 1 more melee defense as well as 2 more melee attack. Just in general, this is just a significantly better unit, and it actually starts getting really well armored at 41. 41 armor is pretty crazy for a shock cavalry, especially one of its price. Now you do have an upgrade on this with your mercenary Iberian heavy cavalry, but this unit's actually really, really cheap for the stats it offers. Like this early game variant's pretty mediocre, but the late game variant is truly worth getting. And just a great shock component. Just remember, it's going to come from your first population class, so ultimately you might have to be a little bit conservative with recruiting these guys unless you just have a ton of nobles. Don't forget, your best infantry is going to come from your first population class, so you may have to conserve these guys, but at the end of the day, it's totally worth getting. They serve an important shock component in your army, and they're definitely good. Now, here's your Carthaginian Sacred Band cavalry, and like the Libby Phoenicians, these guys are kind of like a versatile jack-of-all-trades style unit. Now, they are exceptionally well armored, like both the Sacred Band cavalries that you get, but subsequently they're not the best at actual fighting. So these guys are more or less just an extremely survivable unit. This is the type of unit that's almost impossible to kill. And the late game variant's actually very heavy. But anyway, like these fighting stats really aren't spectacular. They're basically akin to what you'd expect from like a typical Greek-style citizen cavalry, just exceptionally well armored, like oddly well armored. Like we're nearing cataphract levels with the Sacred Band, so be wary. These guys can really pack a punch. And I'm talking about the two of them collectively, and there really isn't a huge amount of difference between the early game variant and the late game variant that you get turn 120. You get a little bit of a quality of life improvement with the late ones, and they do become very heavy, which is a nice upgrade too. As well as just a little bit more fighting stats, a little bit more armor. But both of these are so chunky and so good that they're kind of good from the onset with the early game variant anyway. Now, with your last mercenary barrack tier, you do get these mercenary Iberian heavy cavalry, and these guys are identical to the Editani noble cavalry. And this unit is just insanely well armored. It's a 49 armor lancer, but has a very heavy shot cavalry. This unit is better than both of your Carthaginian citizen cavalries, whether it's your early game variant or your late game variant. The only difference is that they're significantly more expensive. So while this unit isn't like significantly more offensively capable, they're just heavier and they're more expensive. But you know what? They do come from your subject population class, just like all your other mercenaries. So if you're looking for a high tier cavalry, and this is objectively just a very top of the line tier cavalry, like outside of the Parthians and Seleucids and Bactrians, you know, the best cavalry factions in the game, you won't really find much better than this. So considering that you can get a unit of that caliber from your third tier population, you know, it's just an exceptional unit to have in your roster. So get these guys in abundance come late game. They are exceptionally good and will be a great hammer to your Sacred Band anvil. Now moving on to your missile cavalry, you have the infamous Numidian cavalry, the scourge of the Romans until the Romans managed to convert them to their side. And the Numidians are oddly capable as melee fighters. That's really the main asset of these guys. And they're just exceptionally quick. Really, really fast. This is the fastest game. Sorry, this is the fastest cavalry in the game. Like, even though there's many 8-speed cavalry, believe me, these ones are just a little bit quicker because of this horse breed that they have here. See, like, they can go over heavy terrain that would slow down other mounts, making these guys by far the best cavalry in terms of speed. They can also guerrilla deploy. You can see they can hide in virtually everything. They ignore terrain, Parthian shot, resistant to heat, stalk, snipe. Like, these guys have every single special ability that a cavalry can have. Like, these guys are odd specialists. And 31 weapon damage is crazy. This is really, like, what makes them super good in an actual fight. Although, you know, melee attack and melee defense aren't anything exceptional. But the weakness of this unit is the 4 armor. Without a doubt, like, 4 armor is pretty bad. It is pretty bad. Like, these guys will go down in a fight despite these fighting stats. Like, really, what these fighting stats ensure is that the mercenary Numidians are exceptionally good at killing skirmishers. But this isn't really the type of unit that's going to plow into enemy legionaries or enemy heavy infantry and expect to tell the tale. Which, truthfully, in real life, Numidian cavalry were like that. They were just expert skirmishers. You know, they'll dominate the skirmish, but outside of that particular part of the battle, they won't really play much of a point. Like, they won't really play much of a role. Which is what these stats ensure. But you know what? It is good to have, like, a skirmish specialist. Like, if you bring 1 of these in your army, or 2 of these in your army, I feel like you can get a lot of value out of them if you know how to use them. Which is really dart around, kill the enemy skirmishers the moment that the enemy infantry abandoned them. Then after that, use your javelins to pelt the enemy heavy infantry in the rear and cause outstanding casualties with 90 men throwing elite javelins. Now moving on to your beasts of war and special weapons, you have the chariot. Now the Carthaginian chariot is good, but ultimately if we want to assess its value, we really do have to compare it with that of the Seleucid scythe chariot. I mean, you can already see, like, through contrast here, that it's a little bit lighter. It's a little bit weaker. Doesn't have as much health. Actually, no, the health is the same. I didn't really look at this chariot, to be honest, because I don't really like chariots all that much. 53 armor. I mean, the Carthaginian one is cheaper, so I assume it's a little bit less armored. You know, it's a little bit weaker than a Seleucid scythe chariot, but ultimately, it's still going to be a useful unit. I don't really like chariots in Divide et Impera. Like, sure, you can get like 500 kills if your AI opponent just does something really dumb. But at the same time, I don't really like to abuse AI stupidity to that extent. And simultaneously, I feel like these guys are a bit of a risk and just significantly weaker than elephants in this mod. Like, I've had so much more luck with elephants than chariots. So, considering that Carthage is kind of infamous for its, you know, usage of elephants, I wouldn't really go for the chariot option. But these guys are available in early game, as long as you get, like, the tier 2 barrack. I was able to recruit them, even though the Divide et Impera website said otherwise. I think that there was, like, an update or something. So, honestly, like, they are pretty good for what you need to do with them, because I wouldn't really bring them myself. You know, these guys can definitely disrupt the enemy, cause intense morale damage, kill enemy skirmishers or anything that's loose or out of formation in abundance. Simultaneously, these guys will perish on the front of phalanxes quite easily and get bogged down by heavy infantry and slaughtered if you don't micro them constantly. Now, moving on to your elephants, though, Carthage doesn't have the best elephants. Like, out of all of these units, I'd only really consider bringing the Carthaginian Atlas elephants. Now, admittedly, because, like, as I said, the AI is not particularly intelligent, you absolutely can do damage with African elephants and African war elephants, and frankly, these two units are pretty cheap. Like, relative to the typical cost of elephants, these things feel a lot more like an elite cavalry unit in terms of maintenance fees, while your typical Indian elephant will cost you like a good 4,000 or 5,000 in custom battle, which equates to like 500, 600 on the campaign map, you know, usually for ludicrous to maintain. But they're so much better. African elephants only come with 13 men in the unit, Indian elephants come with 27. Way more people on the elephants. Now, these elephants are much smaller, a lot easier to kill. Like, Roman's early game spearmen will tear into these guys with a vengeance. You know, another thing, if you're fighting a mostly spear-based opponent, you don't want to bring elephants. If you're fighting an opponent that has a good amount of swords worked into their army, elephants could be a lot better. But that's kind of all that I have to say when it comes to elephants. I personally wouldn't use them much, but amongst the Carthaginian options, it's only really the Atlas elephants that I believe are worthwhile to bring. I wouldn't really bring the war elephants or the African elephants, but it's up to you. You know, elephants can always do damage. They do great morale damage, so if you can hold these guys back and then activate them and send them into the enemy rear, that's how you can get an army to rout without having to even kill their units, really. Just scare them off. But that's really it when it comes to the Carthaginian roster. Overall, this roster is quite powerful. However, it's not amongst the most elite factions in the game. Like, I take the Seleucids over them. I take the Romans over them. I would take the Bactrians. Actually, I'm not sure if I would take the Bactrians over them, but they're close to the Bactrians. Maybe I would. But, you know, I think it's pretty fair to put them on a similar level, I would say. Just because the Carthaginians do have a lot more options in these categories, and they do. Actually, no, I think I would take the Bactrians over the Carthaginians. I think I would take the Bactrians. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think I would. Maybe the Carthaginians are somewhat similar to the Ptolemies, though, who are a little bit weaker in my opinion. But in any case, the Carthaginians are good, though. They are definitely good. Like, they deserve the title of Empire. Undoubtedly, and their roster represents it. They have great skirmishers, cost-effective cavalry, the best hoplite phalanxes, and a neat and versatile array of spears and melee infantry. And while these two categories might not be the best, amongst the Hellenic and Hellenistic factions, they absolutely are amongst the best. And since you have all the other bells and whistles that these more Grecian-style factions have to offer, you know, overall you get class amongst the Carthaginians. So I would rate this roster a solid 8 out of 10, I would say. There's a lot of value here, just also obvious weaknesses in some regards when it comes to maybe elite cavalry and, you know, elite melee infantry and the lack of pikes. But I would say dooms Carthage. But you know what? The missile infantry part is absolutely elite. And you really don't have any lack of quality or value here. And overall, just a general cost efficiency of the Carthaginian roster, I feel like that's one of the main things that you need to value Carthage for. Now, when it comes to how difficult this campaign is, it absolutely is. Amongst the start positions, I believe it to be the most complex. I feel like even the Seleucid start position is a lot simpler to figure out than Carthage. One, due to the war with Rome, which is inevitable, and two, just because of how generally overstretched your empire is. Simultaneously, you know, an 8 out of 10 roster is good, but it leaves room for improvement, so we don't quite have as many tools and, I would say, really, really good units to work with as many of the power factions, like the Romans and the Seleucids. Therefore, I'd say that this is a pretty hard campaign. I'd give it a good 7 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. I think it is a challenging campaign. I don't think it is an absolute nightmare, because ultimately it's not like you're the RDA, who would probably get into a war with the Romans anyway and not have the tools that Carthage has. Like, Carthage has the tools to deal with anybody. It's just a lot of people, like specifically the Romans, the powerhouse that cheats with money every step of the way, that want to kill you as Carthage. So because of that, solely because of that, I would say that the Carthaginians are a solid 7 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. And in terms of how much you need to play this campaign, that's a 10 out of 10. This is such a unique campaign, both in terms of the roster composition, the way that units are recruited, the unique challenge of being extremely overstretched from turn 1. I want to play this campaign from just testing out their units and trying things out. And I think that anyone would have a ton of fun playing the Carthaginian campaign as long as you don't get overly frustrated by the difficulty. So that's all I have to say when it comes to Carthage. Now we're going to be moving on to the Britannian factions, as ultimately they are quite different than the typical Gallic fare that we've been looking at with these guides and the Iberians. Like, they are a very unique breed of barbarian faction whose relative isolation compared to the other Celtic-inspired factions does reflect in their fighting style and the units that they have. So stay tuned for those, and if you like this video, please like the video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you, and I'll see you later. Bye.